On May 25, 1984, 22-year-old Pia Knudsen watched a masked man shoot her husband 16 times through their car windscreen in broad daylight on a quiet street in Copenhagen. But when asked years later, she remembered only one thing. Not the gunshots or the chaos, but the eyes of the killer. The man behind those eyes was Jørn Jønke Nielsen, the youngest co-founder of any Hells Angels chapter in history, and the most brutal figure the European biker world ever produced. This is the story of the Hells Angel who became Denmark's most feared enforcer, the making of an enforcer. The making of an enforcer. In 1980, a 20-year-old man walked out of a Danish prison and immediately founded the first Hells Angels chapter in Scandinavia. He had been inside for stabbing a man in a bar. Before that, he had been arrested at 15 for fighting in another bar. He had not spent his teenage years drifting toward violence. His name was Jørn Nielsen. Everyone in the Danish biker world called him Jønke, and what he built in the decade that followed would make him the most feared enforcer in the history of the Danish Hells Angels. Copenhagen in the late 1970s was a city with a biker culture that operated by its own rules. The clubs that dominated the scene called themselves rocker clubs in the European tradition, and they fought over territory, reputation, and the drug markets that were expanding rapidly through the city. Nielsen had grown up inside that world from his early teens. By the time he bought his first motorcycle in 1978, while still serving his sentence for the stabbing, he already understood what the rocker world was and what it required of the men who wanted to rise inside it. When he was released in 1980, he did not ease himself back into civilian life. He co-founded the Nørrebro Copenhagen chapter of the Hells Angels, alongside Bent Blondie Svane Nielsen, who was no relation. The chapter had been granted full patch status by Big Willem van Boxtel, the president of the Hells Angels Amsterdam chapter, and the unofficial leader of all European Hells Angels. It was the first Hells Angels chapter anywhere in Scandinavia. Nielsen was 20 years old. From the beginning, he understood that the patch alone was not enough. The Danish public needed to know the Hells Angels existed and needed to feel something about that knowledge. Nielsen provided the feeling deliberately. He wore Nazi symbols, swastikas, and white power clothing in public not out of ideology, but out of calculation. He wrote in his memoir that dirty, ragged clothes, and preferably with as many offensive symbols as possible, could really get the bourgeois animals out of the armchair. Denmark had been occupied by Nazi Germany from 1940 to 1945. The use of those symbols in Danish public life was not provocative in a general sense. It was specifically designed to wound.
Så jeg kunne huske den motorcykelklub, som vi var gode venner med i Nomads, da jeg kom ind i det, der kan jeg huske, de havde A-kors på ryggen. Det brød jeg mig så ikke så meget om, men det var jo ikke for at være nazister. Det var for at provokere borgerskab.
Nielsen later explained the philosophical foundation of that entitlement in a way that revealed more about his worldview than any criminal charge ever could. When asked to reflect on the violence his chapter carried out, he compared it to countries that invade other nations in the name of freedom. We felt we had the right, he said. Not that they believed they were justified after the fact, that they genuinely believed at the time that they were entitled to do what they did. The most feared enforcer in Danish Hells Angels history did not describe his violence as criminal. He described it as a right. That belief would drive everything that came next. To understand what the Hells Angels were fighting for in Copenhagen in the early 1980s, you need to understand what Freetown Christiania was. In 1971, a group of squatters and social activists had taken over an abandoned military base in the heart of Copenhagen and declared it an autonomous zone. They called it Freetown Christiania. The Danish government proved unwilling to evict them. Danish law effectively did not apply inside its borders. Over the following decade, Christiania became something that nobody who founded it had intended. It became the largest open drug market in Europe. Hundreds of thousands of people from across Europe and North America traveled to Copenhagen specifically to buy drugs in Christiania every year. The market was worth enormous amounts of money, and it was controlled by the Bullshit Motorcycle Club. The Bullshit MC had seized control of Christiania's drug trade in the late 1970s. They were based in the Christiania district itself, and their control of that market gave them a power and a financial base that made them the dominant criminal motorcycle club in Copenhagen before the Hells Angels arrived. When Nielsen founded the Nørrebro chapter in 1980, the Bullshit MC represented the single largest obstacle to everything he was trying to build. Their market was the prize. Their president, Henning Norbert Knudsen, known as Mackerel, was the man who stood between the Hells Angels and everything Christiania represented. But here is what the public record of the conflict between the two clubs never captured. At some point during the escalating tension, the Bullshit MC made an offer to the Hells Angels. They proposed sharing half of Christiania's hash market as a way to avoid open war, half of the largest drug market in Europe. The Hells Angels said no. They turned it down not because the terms were insufficient, but because accepting the offer would mean treating the Bullshit MC as equals worth negotiating with. In Nielsen's worldview and in the worldview of the chapter, he led the Bullshit MC were not equals. They were a lower form of criminal organization that had not yet understood its own irrelevance. Status mattered more than money. The Hells Angels believed they were already above the Bullshit MC before a single shot had been fired. Accepting their offer would have contradicted everything the Danish chapter had been built to represent, but the war that followed was not purely about that status calculation. There was a trigger that made it personal in a way that territory and drug markets never could. Bullshit MC members had been beating women connected to the Hells Angels. One woman had her jaw broken. Nielsen described this making him furious in a way that the abstract conflict over Christiania never had. The public would come to understand the Copenhagen biker war as a criminal dispute over drug territory. What it also was a personal war driven by something much simpler. Men in his orbit were hurting women, and Nielsen decided that was going to stop. In November 1983, Bullshit MC President Mackerel made a decision that accelerated everything. He appeared on live Danish television on the show Mellem Mennesker, meaning between humans, and publicly stated that he would not allow an American motorcycle club like the Hells Angels to gain control in Denmark. Nielsen saw it, and Mackerel had less than 6 months left to live the restaurant attack. On September 24, 1983, Nielsen received a phone call from a barman. 4 members of the Bullshit MC were drinking at the restaurant Promenaden in Copenhagen. Nielsen did not deliberate. He gathered 3 Hells Angels and they walked into that restaurant the same night. What followed was not a brawl. It was an attack. Nielsen and his men came in with knives and they used them. By the time it was over, 2 Bullshit MC members were dead. Steen Grabo Grander and Flemming Halt Jensen were killed at the table. A third member, Michael Peter Enoch, survived with serious wounds. The 4 men who had been drinking in a Copenhagen restaurant that evening had walked in as members of the dominant criminal motorcycle club in the city. 2 of them did not walk out. The attack sent a message that the Bullshit MC could not ignore and could not adequately respond to. The Hells Angels had not waited for a provocation in the sense that the rocker world understood provocations. They had received information about an opportunity, and they had acted on it the same night. Swiftly, deliberately, without hesitation. But the restaurant attack was not the end of it. It was the opening statement. The Bullshit MC was still standing. Mackerel was still alive. And Nielsen had already decided that the television appearance in November would be the last public act of defiance the Bullshit MC president would ever make. The decision about what came next was not made in a moment of anger. It was not made in response to a specific incident or a fresh provocation. Nielsen later described in interviews how he made the decision to kill Mackerel 2 days before he did it. He sat with that decision. He accepted it mentally. He did not talk himself into it or out of it. He simply decided and then waited for the day to arrive. That detail is the most important thing about Jørn Nielsen that no criminal charge or court sentence ever captured. The Danish sources have given us extraordinary new details that were not in the English language sources. The killing was not on a driveway, as all English sources stated. It was inside Mackerel's car. Nielsen hid in a van parked across the street. When Mackerel and his wife Pia sat down in their orange Volkswagen outside their home on Agerlundsvej, on Amager, Nielsen jumped out masked and fired a burst of submachine gun rounds through the windscreen. Pia screamed and dived out of the car. Nielsen then walked to the car door and fired another burst into Mackerel's back. Mackerel was hit by 16 bullets in the neck, chest, and back, and was hanging half out of the car door with his legs tangled around the gear stick and his head resting on the asphalt. Nielsen later described the killing in a Canal Fem documentary called Forbrydelser der rystede Danmark, meaning crimes that shook Denmark. His quotes from that documentary are the viral interview you are referring to. The specific quotes are, "I do not think you should think too much when you are on your way out to kill another person. I cannot see whether he is dead. I empty the magazine into him until it does not shoot anymore. Both to be certain he is dead because that is why I came, but also to be certain that nobody picks up the submachine gun and shoots me in the back when I cycle away." He had arrived at the address with a submachine gun loaded with 28 rounds in a sports bag in a van with a bicycle in the back. After the shooting, he cycled away from the scene. 3 Hells Angels were convicted for supporting the killing. Jens Peter Christensen received 12 years. Christian Middelbo received 7. Nielsen himself was already gone. Within hours of cycling away from that orange Volkswagen on Amager, he was on his way out of Denmark. By 1988, 13 people had been killed in the war between the Hells Angels and the Bullshit MC. The Bullshit MC had completely disbanded. The commander of the Serious Organized Crime Agency of the Danish police later told investigators that the Hells Angels under Nielsen's leadership had eliminated the bullshit totally. Mackerel had told Danish television in November 1983 that he would not allow the Hells Angels to take control in Denmark. 6 months later, he was hit by 16 bullets in his own car on his own street. And 6 months after that, his club no longer existed. Nielsen left Denmark the day of the murder. He had no intention of standing in a courtroom and answering for what he had done on that driveway. What followed was not the panicked flight of a man who had lost control of a situation. It was the calculated disappearance of a man who had planned for this possibility the same way he had planned everything else. Deliberately, in advance, without sentiment. He made his way to Canada using a fake passport and assumed an entirely new identity. In Vancouver, he joined the East End chapter of the Hells Angels under that alias. The East End Vancouver chapter was documented by law enforcement as one of the most violent Hells Angels chapters in Western Canada. Nielsen had not hidden himself among civilians. He had walked directly into another chapter of the same organization and continued operating inside the world he knew. In Canada, he worked as a bouncer. He played sports. He built friendships with police officers. He got into street fights alongside cops who had no idea the man standing next to them was wanted for murder in Denmark. A man with a fake passport and a submachine gun killing on his record was living openly among law enforcement and doing it so effectively that nobody looked twice. Nielsen later described his time as a fugitive as having a movie-like quality. There was a bit of James Bond over it, he said. He was not just hiding. He was performing a role with the same cold control he brought to everything else. In 1985, while still a fugitive, Nielsen wrote his first memoir. He called it Mitt Liv, My Life. He wrote it on the run from a murder charge in a country he could not return to, and it became a bestseller in Denmark. The public that Nielsen had spent years trying to provoke with Nazi symbols and outrageous behavior was now buying his autobiography in large numbers. In the book, he portrayed himself as a victim of Danish society. He described his deliberate use of offensive symbols as a response to a country that was conformist and oppressive. He presented the violence not as crime, but as a rational response to a world that had never made room for men like him. The Danish public read it and bought more copies, but the James Bond performance had a time limit. Nielsen was eventually identified and apprehended in Canada. He was extradited to Denmark and stood before a court that sentenced him to 16 years in prison. He was transferred to a Danish facility in 1988 and began what would become the strangest phase of his already extraordinary story. Inside prison, Nielsen discovered something unexpected. He had always been a man who described himself as feeling nothing, no emotional turbulence, no psychological weight. But inside his cell, he encountered something that came close to breaking through that blankness. Loneliness, anxiety, a kind of emotional isolation that the violence and the movement and the constant performance of the fugitive years had kept at bay. He did not know what to do with it, and then he started writing. After I started writing, he said, I did not feel it anymore. The man who felt nothing after committing murder had found the only thing capable of moving him emotionally was putting words on paper. Violence did not break Jørn Nielsen. Stillness almost did, and writing saved him from it. The Celebrity Prisoner. A 16-year prison sentence in most criminal careers marks the end of influence. The organization moves on. New leadership emerges. The man inside becomes a memory that the club references occasionally and then less and less until he is simply a name from a period that the current membership did not experience. That is not what happened with Jørn Nielsen. From inside his Danish prison cell, Nielsen became one of the most recognizable public figures in Denmark. He appeared on television. He appeared on radio. He gave interviews. He wrote books. He argued with journalists and film directors and anyone who characterized the Hells Angels in ways he considered inaccurate. In 1997, the Danish film director Erik Clausen publicly stated that Nielsen's books were full of lies and distorted. Nielsen sued him for libel. He lost the case in 1999 when a judge ruled that Clausen's statement did not damage Nielsen's reputation. The judge's reasoning was that being called a liar did not constitute reputational damage for a man convicted of murder. Nielsen disputed this characterization and continued giving interviews anyway. He was not simply managing his public image from behind bars. He was running operations. From his cell, Nielsen orchestrated one of the most audacious expansions in European Hells Angels history. He decided the club needed a chapter in Sweden. But rather than negotiate with the existing Swedish biker clubs, he designed a competition that he described with the kind of detached efficiency that had characterized everything he had ever done. There were 3 rival biker gangs in Malmö. Nielsen made them an offer. Whichever gang eliminated the other 2 first would be granted Hells Angels hang-around status with the prospect of full-patch membership to follow. He then waited to see who won. The Dirty Draggles, under the leadership of Thomas Müller, won the competition by eliminating the other 2 gangs. They were granted hang-around status in 1990 and full-patch status in 1993. Nielsen had expanded the Hells Angels into Sweden without leaving his cell, without attending a single meeting, without riding a single kilometer of Swedish road. He had simply created the conditions for violence and then awarded the survivors. But his criminal record created a complication that he could not resolve from inside a prison or outside one. The United States does not allow foreigners with criminal records to enter its borders. Nielsen could not travel to meet Sonny Barger. He could not attend the international Hells Angels gatherings that connected the European chapters to the American leadership. Thomas Müller, who had no criminal record at the time, traveled to the United States and met Barger directly. For that reason, Nielsen was to a significant extent replaced as the leader of the European Hells Angels by Müller. The man who had founded Scandinavia's first chapter and orchestrated the Swedish expansion from a prison cell was sidelined from the international stage by a paperwork restriction that his own violence had created. He was released on parole in 1994. The great Nordic biker war between the Hells Angels and the Bandidos was already building. Nielsen walked out of prison and into the middle of it, and resumed his position as the dominant figure in the Danish Hells Angels, as if the 16 years had been a brief interruption rather than the defining period of most men's lives. The Nordic Biker War, the conflict that erupted across Scandinavia in 1994 between the Hells Angels and the Bandidos, was unlike anything the European criminal world had seen before. It was not a street gang dispute. It was not a localized territorial conflict between 2 clubs in the same city. It was a coordinated war fought simultaneously across Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and Finland, using military-grade weapons against targets that included clubhouses, prisons, and civilian gathering places. By the time it ended, 11 people had been murdered and 74 attempted murders had been documented. 96 people were wounded across 4 countries. And at the center of the Danish side of that war was Jørn Nielsen, who had walked out of prison in 1994 and resumed command as if the previous 16 years had happened to someone else. The opening exchanges were violent, but the conflict escalated into something that Danish law enforcement had no framework for when both sides began acquiring and deploying weapons that belonged on a battlefield rather than in a criminal dispute. Anti-tank rockets were fired at clubhouses. Car bombs were planted outside headquarters. Drive-by shootings were carried out in broad daylight across multiple Scandinavian cities. The Bandidos were not a club the Hells Angels could eliminate, the way they had eliminated the bullshit MC a decade earlier. They were an organization of comparable size, strength, and willingness to absorb casualties and keep fighting. On July 25, 1996, someone decided that the most efficient way to address the Nielsen problem was to go directly to his prison cell. Nielsen had been returned to custody on a parole violation and was being held at Jyderup State Prison. Between 2 and 4 men infiltrated the facility and made their way to his cell. His cell was locked. That did not stop them. They fired over 20 rounds from an automatic weapon through the cell window. Nielsen was shot twice in the abdomen and once in the arm. He survived. The attempt on his life inside a Danish state prison while he was in the custody of the Danish government was one of the most extraordinary events of the entire Nordic biker war. It demonstrated that the Bandidos considered Nielsen significant enough to target even inside a maximum security facility, and that they were willing to carry out an operation of that complexity and risk to reach him. It also demonstrated something about Nielsen specifically, that even while incarcerated, he was considered the operational heart of the Danish Hells Angels, rather than a sidelined figure waiting for release. 3 months later, on October 6, 1996, a shoulder-fired rocket was fired at the Hells Angels' Copenhagen clubhouse during a party. The weapon penetrated the building's concrete walls and exploded inside. 2 people were killed. One was Louis Linda Nielsen, a Hells Angels prospect. The other was Jana Krohn, a 29-year-old woman from the local neighborhood who had been invited to the party via posters the club had placed in the area. She had no connection to any motorcycle club. She had simply accepted an invitation and walked into a building that someone had decided to destroy with a rocket launcher. The death of Jana Krohn changed everything. The Danish public had been following the biker war with a mixture of fear and the distant detachment that comes from believing violence of that kind only touches the people who choose to be involved in it. Krohn's death collapsed that distance. The Danish government responded by passing the Rockerloven the Rocker Act, which allowed police to evict motorcycle clubs from their clubhouses. Politicians who had previously treated the biker war as a law enforcement problem began treating it as a national crisis. The pressure on both the Hells Angels and the Bandidos to find an exit from the conflict became overwhelming. Nielsen was paroled in summer 1998. He had survived a murder conviction, a 16-year sentence, a prison assassination attempt, and a Scandinavian biker war that had consumed 4 countries for 3 years. He was 38 years old and the most recognizable figure in the Danish Hells Angels. The organization he had co-founded in 1980 controlled territory that the peace treaty had now formalized in writing down to individual bars and nightclubs. The bullshit MC that had controlled Christiania when he founded the chapter was gone. The Swedish expansion he had engineered from his cell was producing chapters. The Nordic biker war that had almost killed him in his cell at Jyderup had ended with a televised handshake. By any measure available to the outlaw motorcycle club world, Jørn Nielsen had won. But the world Nielsen returned to in 1998 was not the same world he had left in 1984. The Danish public knew who he was in a way that went beyond criminal notoriety. He had given too many interviews, written too many books, appeared on too much television from inside his cell. He had made himself a public figure in a country where public figures are subject to a specific kind of scrutiny that the biker world had no framework for managing. He was famous in Denmark in the way that few criminals ever become famous. Not feared at a distance, but known personally by a public that had watched him argue with film directors and lose libel cases and sign peace treaties on live television. In August 2001, that familiarity produced consequences. A Bandidos associate named Flemming Jensen was beaten and stabbed to death by Hells Angels members in a tavern in Aalborg. Witnesses told investigators that Nielsen had been present and had kicked and stomped on Jensen during the attack. Nielsen was arrested. In September 2002, he was sentenced to 4 years in prison for aggravated assault resulting in death. He was returned to the institution he had spent so much of his adult life inside. The years that followed produced a slow deterioration in his relationship with the organization he had built. He had been the dominant figure in the Danish Hells Angels for over 2 decades, but the club he returned to after each prison sentence was subtly different from the one he had left. Younger leadership, different priorities. The kind of internal politics that accumulate in any organization over decades and that become particularly complicated when the founding figure is periodically absent and then returns expecting to resume his previous position. On November 18, 2020, the Hells Angels expelled Jørn Nielsen. The status assigned to him was out in bad standing. In the language of the outlaw motorcycle club world, that designation means the expulsion is not neutral. It carries specific implications about how former members are expected to be treated by those who remain inside. Nielsen was not simply leaving. He was being pushed out in the most emphatic way the club's internal rules allowed. In a March 2021 interview, Nielsen described the expulsion as the product of an internal coup orchestrated against him amid factional tensions within the club. The Hells Angels provided no official public explanation. Nielsen stated publicly that he had nothing to be ashamed of regarding the murder case. He expressed no regret about the killing of Mackerel, no regret about the restaurant attack, no regret about the years of violence that had defined his career. Nothing happened inside me, he had said when asked about the murder. That position had not changed in 4 decades. After the expulsion, Nielsen attempted something that nobody who had known him in the 1980s could have anticipated. He entered Danish politics. He founded a party called Stabilt Demokrati, meaning stable democracy, and stood for election to the Copenhagen City Council. The incumbent Copenhagen mayor, Peter Rabeck Juel, publicly refused to participate in any debate that included Nielsen labeling him still a murderer and directing municipal lawyers to examine his eligibility. A culture counselor declared publicly, "We do not want him in the council." Nielsen campaigned anyway, stating he had nothing to be ashamed of. He did not win. He went into self-imposed exile in New Zealand. The man who had walked out of prison in 1980 and immediately founded the first Hells Angels chapter in Scandinavia, who had killed the president of the rival club on his own driveway in front of his wife and felt nothing, who had written a best-selling memoir while a wanted fugitive in Canada, who had orchestrated the Swedish Hells Angels expansion from inside a Danish prison cell, who had survived being shot 3 times through his cell window during the Nordic biker war, who had signed a peace treaty on live Danish television, who had spent 4 decades as the most feared enforcer in the history of the Danish Hells Angels. That man was living in New Zealand, having been expelled in bad standing by the organization he had built from nothing and having failed to win a seat on the Copenhagen City Council. The outlaw motorcycle club world produces extraordinary arcs, but very few of them end quite like this one. Jørn Nielsen co-founded the first Hells Angels chapter in Scandinavia in 1980, eliminated an entire rival club, destroyed their president on his own driveway, and ran the Danish chapter for 4 decades from prison cells and courtrooms and televised press conferences. In 2020, the organization he built expelled him. If you want to see what the men who built organizations like this one were capable of at their most extreme, click the next video.